The African slavery in America follows the expansion of three agricultural crops: sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Failed to use the Amerindian as hand labor, conditions were created for the beginning of the maritime slave trade. For 3 centuries, Brazil would consume more African slaves than any other area of the Atlantic, absorbing 40% of all traffic in that ocean. These were the essential part of the agriculture of sugarcane and the manufacture of sugar, which was proclaimed the natural freedom of the Indians by Don Sebastian on the 20th of March, 1570. The supply of slaves in Brazil was made from Portuguese centres of the African coast. The business was formed by parts of slaves, not involving their heads, but the space they occupied and what they were worth for work. In 1600, the black population in Brazil was about 13,000 to 13,500 individuals. The huge numbers of imported slaves also had the right to be in terms of trafficking, since the average life of a slave did not exceed 7 years, and the devices did not incite procreation, which required the support of children in phase of growth, without any immediate income. The need for slaves in Brazil increased further when gold mines were discovered at the end of the 17th century. The lack of slaves was felt throughout the next century, and this led the Marquês of Pombal Alvará of 19th September 1761 to prohibit the entry of slaves on the mainland, extending in 1773 to the Azores and Madeira to forward all slaves to Brazil. At the end of the 17th century, laws were promulgated prohibiting overcrowding of vessels and requiring appropriate nutrition and health conditions, measures that were in the traffickers' own interests, since the more that died on the trip, the more the prejudice. In contrast to the Amerindian slavery, the black slave was never convicted, although men like Father Antonio Vieira tried to protect the blacks against abuse. The settlers, in turn, quickly took note that the African slaves were much better than the Indians, being stronger, more disciplined, and more persistent. The labour required for the sugar economy was the main reason for importing slaves. Each sugar mill required a minimum of 80 slaves, in addition to the hundreds who had to work in the fields, for the slavery and sugar plantations were considered as of two inseparable economic realities. The number of devices decoupled of mid-16th century to the end of the 17th century. The total number of slaves imported by Brazil in that time has achieved between 1570 and 1600 some 50,000. Between 1600 and 1650, about 200,000, and about 150,000 more between 1650 and 1670. The slaves were baptized before boarding, because the average mortality was around 10%, but sometimes reaching over 50%, and the vessels of transport of slaves were called tumbeiros, in other words, undertakers. The average duration of the journey from Angola was 25 days until Pernambuco, 40 to the Bay, and 50 to Rio de Janeiro. If the Bergantin or the Caravel came from Mozambique, it was another month of travel. The supplies were calculated in view of the average time of a journey, for a mishap like a storm, or simply a lack of wind would likely delay a trip and run the risk of hunger and thirst, leading to death. The great industrial changes of the 18th and 19th centuries made possible the emergence of the anti-slavery movement achieved by the abolition of slavery in most states of Europe. Following the Treaty of Vienna, 1815, to England and Portugal, an agreement was signed with the purpose of finally reducing the slave trade in the Portuguese possessions. Sá da Bandeira in 1836 banned all imports and exports of slaves to the south of the equator, still trying to end the work required of the black. However, the demand for slaves in the independent Brazil still continued. The arrival of slaves in Brazil reached between 1846 to 1849 an average of 50,000, having fallen to 700 in 1852, although from 1850 the slave trade had entered into decline. Only in 1888, with the Oria Act, did the total abolition of slavery come to an end, with the sale of Africans. At this time in Brazil, there were more than 2 million slaves. Now, Brazil began a new phase based on the policy of alluring European immigration in order to make up for the lack of arms for agriculture and emerging industrialization.